Okay, so first we have Marcus Witcher, who is big on my screen. I don't know about yours. He is a teaching assistant professor of economic history at West Virginia University, where he also serves as manager of undergraduate programs for the NE Regulatory Research Center. He completed his PhD in history from the University of Alabama in 2017. His first book, Getting Right with Reagan, The Struggle for True Conservatism, 1980 to 2016, was published by the University Press of Kansas in 2019. Witcher is also the co-editor of 7 edited collections and has been published in a diverse range of publications, including Reason Magazine, National Review, Modern Age, and the Washington Post. His most recent book, Black Liberation Through the Marketplace, Hope, Heartbreak, and the Promise of America, was co-authored with Rachel Ferguson and published by Emancipation Books in 2022. And then I'm going to give you Dave's as well, except it's not showing up on my email. That's not good. Dave might have to give his own introduction. Okay, I'm going to do this off the cuff. David Beito is emeritus professor from the University of Alabama, where he taught Marcus. So you can see the connection here. He is the author of many, many, many fine books, including a recent one that's really making a big splash on the New Deal and FDR. And what's the title, Dave? I know it's standing there behind you.
The New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights.
There it is. Yes. And I'm blaming
15 years of research.
Gmail for not giving me more kinds of things. So Dave is very, very well known as an author and a writer of all kinds of 20th century history and classical liberalism. And Marcus fits in, as you heard, very recent 20th century history. And so you can kind of see a theme here. And what have I left out, David, that you'd like to say about your introduction?
That's fine.
That's it.
Fine.
Okay. I don't know what happened to my Gmail, but anyway, here we go. And David is starting us off, telling us about Rose Wilder Lane, and Rose Lane says.
All right, well, why don't I give you a little bit of background about this project and how Marcus and I got interested in it. I'd always been interested in Rose Wilder Lane, and I'd read her book, Discovery Freedom, and I read a biography of her. And these biographies would briefly mention that, well, in the 1940s, she wrote this column for this Black newspaper. I think it was called an obscure newspaper sometimes. And then I went to the Hoover Library, Hoover Presidential Library, where they have Lane's papers. And there was a sampling of articles that she wrote for this paper. Now, this is fascinating. This is all about race and trying to connect her views to the leading issues of the day involving discrimination and that kind of thing. I thought, well, this is interesting. And then I looked more into it and found out that this was not an obscure paper. In fact, at its height, I think in the 40s, during her heyday there, it had something like 270,000 subscribers. She wrote a weekly column, which would mean by several fold, multiple fold. She potentially at least reached a larger audience with the Pittsburgh Courier than she ever reached with, for example, her magnum opus, Discovery of Freedom. I thought, well, let's look more into it. So Marcus and I did the hard work, and it was kind of laborious. It was a pleasure, though, of collecting these articles. We have over 83, the bulk of them that were published. Many others we couldn't use simply because they were illegible, unfortunately. They hadn't translated well to the microfilm and then eventually to being digitized. So we decided to write about this, and it was a lot of fun. So let me sort of give you a little bit of background about Rose Wilder Lane, and then we'll lead up to her experiences on the Courier. Again, people today who know about Lane, there's several different audiences. They're more libertarian types who might know about her book, The Discovery of Freedom, published in 1943. People might know about her. Well, we're going to get onto that. So why don't I why don't I go through the slides here first? But again, like I said, she really reached her largest audience through this newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier. It was the leading Black newspaper in the United States during this period in terms of circulation. So it didn't just reach people in Pittsburgh. You know, Pullman porters would carry it to the South. It was a well-known national voice of African American thought. She also gained a white audience for these op-eds, although they were again published in the Courier. A gentleman named R.C. Hoyles, who was a libertarian, perhaps almost an anarchist, and he wrote ran a chain of newspapers, a mini chain in the Midwest and Southwest, and he picked up about 1944. He started picking up her articles in the Courier, and so some of them we found in our research were illegible in the Courier, but the reprints, which were exact reprints, we could read those. So it was an interesting project where we had to piece together several different sources. I also will talk a little bit about Lane's background. Go to the next slide, please. There are her parents, Amanzo and Laura Ingalls Wilder. Of course, Laura is much better known than her daughter. Lane had there's Lane on the right. She had a very memorable childhood. She was born in 1886 in De Smet, Dakota Territory. There are just all sorts of stories about how this family was always living on the margin, or at least for about the first 10 years. There were destructive fires that destroyed everything. They were always on the move. They went to Minnesota. They ended up in Mansfield, Missouri, where they purchased a farm and an apple orchard that they named Rocky Ridge. Now, from these experiences, which are mostly Midwestern experiences, I guess you could say it's on the edge there of the West, Lane nurtured an appreciation for the values of self-reliance, individualism. One of her favorite expressions was the old expression of American pioneers, which was root, hog, or die. And the phrase originated to describe the practice of many early settlers in turning their pigs loose to learn to fend for themselves. And for Lane, and many who use the term, it was shorthand for a kind of an endorsement of self-reliance. All right. Now, in a modest way, and this aspect of her life isn't really picked up upon, but how do you describe what she says in the Courier later? How do you link it to her earlier life? And we were interested in that. And one way you could link it was that she grew up in a part of the country that was most supportive of civil rights for African Americans during the period, beginning in the 1890s, all the way to the 1920s. There was legislation to provide for voting rights, the Lodge Bill, then later the Dyer Bill, which is shown here, which was sponsored by a gentleman named Leonidas Dyer, who was from Missouri, one of the places Lane lived, and it made lynchings, he was a Republican, he made lynchings a federal crime, and it actually passed the House. It had the support of President Warren Harding, not often regarded as a great champion of civil rights, but he supported it, and it was passed, but then it was bottled up and it was stopped in the U.S. Senate. Now, if you look at how the delegations in South Dakota, the delegations in Missouri voted, they were overwhelmingly for this bill, which passed much more narrowly in the House. So at least in theory, there's a belief in civil rights that has nurtured her, that is consistent with what comes later. All right. Now, she had a very varied life. Go on to the next one, please. In the period from about 1904, when she left Mansfield, to when she joined the Pittsburgh Courier in 1942. She was married in 1908 to a gentleman named Claire Gillette Lane. They had one child. The child was stillborn, but he's there's this tragedy. She could have overcome them perhaps, but he's not the man for her. He's a very unambitious fellow. I think they got along okay, but they were incompatible, and she soon divorced him, but she kept the, the Lane married name. She worked as a reporter on several papers. She wrote many biographies of very famous people. And she met this gentleman, or at least according to her account, which I think is somewhat embellished, but I think still basically true. John Reed, portrayed in the movie by Warren Beatty, the movie, what was it called? Reds, right? Well, Reed was one of the founders of the Communist Party, and Lane said that she missed out on a meeting that he was at, and that she had not had influenza, a bout of influenza, she might have made that meeting and she probably would have joined the Communist Party. She didn't join because she didn't make the meeting. She described herself as at heart a communist. Now, again, you can certainly confirm that she has, her views are on the left, socialist views, certainly. On to the next one, please. On to the next slide, please. Okay, well, she again went from job to job, writing. She was had a writing job with the American Red Cross. This enabled her to travel throughout Europe. She collaborated closely with her mother to produce the manuscript Pioneer Girl. And then she also collaborated with her mother to produce the Little House on the Prairie series of juvenile books that appeared between 1932 and 1943. Now, what is her role? There's big debate about that. And I'm not that interested in that debate, frankly, because we're more focused on the Pittsburgh Courier. But certainly it was a substantial role. Editing, certainly, acting as a sounding board, and sometimes writing. Again, debates about how extensive that was, but it was a close collaboration, and the collaboration served to shift the trajectory of Lane's own fiction. She wasn't really as much a fiction writer, but she became one. And let's go on to the next one. And her novels include Let the Hurricane Roar, which was later retitled Young Pioneers. By the way, I discovered that there was a radio version of this in the 1940s, which I've never heard. I talked to Deidre yesterday. Said, I'd like to check that out. I don't know if it's out there. Maybe some of you have heard it. But again, it was about the struggles of her, based on the struggles of her parents and grandparents in Dakota Territory in Minnesota. Her libertarian outlook, which was really developing slowly, is becoming in full bloom when she wrote another novel called Free Land. This was in 1938. And in that novel, she favorably described one of the characters as, quote, opposing public money to the rich and public land to the poor. He didn't believe in giving or getting something for nothing. He believed in every man paying his own way. All right. On to the next one, please. A major turning point for Lane, go on to the next slide, please, was an article that she did called Credo, which was in the Saturday Evening Post, one of the leading publications of its time. And it was so successful, got so much attention, that she wrote a book later that year called Give Me Liberty. And the themes of this book are very much interrelated. They discuss her leftist background, why she broke from leftism. And part of the reason she did, according to the book, is her foreign travels, including to the Soviet Union. And there she, was quite impressed by some of the things she observed. She went to peasant villages, and one peasant there said, well, we've lived these communal values for a long time. sharing and that kind of thing. And she wondered, though, why this guy wasn't more friendly to communism, which is what the central government was trying to bring about. And the man told her that central state planning will not work. In Moscow, there are only men, and man is not God. A man is only a man's head. And 100 heads together do not make one great head. No, only God can know Russia. So she sort of concluded from this that people are basically the same. They, wherever you go, they have the same incentive system. They have the same talents in many ways, or at least they're similar. And she said that for example, the people that she met on the plains of Georgia in the Soviet Union were an industrious, thrifty, good-natured, and eminently sensible people, as much as anywhere. But what had held them back? According to Lane, it was a lack of property rights. It was a lack of freedom. And so she said, if you have the right institutional structure, anybody can thrive. Very optimistic from her standpoint view. Now, Lane rarely discussed the issue of racism. Just wasn't something that she wrote about. But there's some hints of what came later, because she did discuss in a letter to the editor, she was motivated to write it, these persecution of Jews, of anti-Semitism, of persecution of American Jews. She wrote a letter to the editor in 1938 of the American Mercury, and here's what she said. Here's how she started. One thing should be said, must be said, cannot be said too often about the Jews in America. It is that any discrimination against them is an attack on the foundations of the Republic. She condemned this discrimination as anathema to American traditions, that human beings have a right to be regarded as human beings, each on his own merits, regardless of race or any other classification. So really, it's a similar kind of argument, which she kind of spins out a little bit more of the Pittsburgh Courier 4 years later. All right, now go on to the next one, please. This was the period, the late 30s, the early 1940s of the so-called old right, the American old right, quite different than the modern right. These were people that distrusted, often in a kind of general way, centralized power. They distrusted the New Deal. They didn't like foreign alliances. Leading figures in the old right included, often included Midwesterners. They're much stronger in the Midwest, really, than anywhere else, maybe the West and the Midwest. They included people like Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, the son of the president, former president, and Robert R. McCormick. There he is on time. He's the publisher of the Chicago Tribune. And again, they, like Lane, were very suspicious of Roosevelt and what they regarded as kind of foreign interventionism and centralized control. And if you go to the next one, please. Again, they feared that there was a war fever developing. A lot of them had lived through World War I, or all of them had observed it and didn't want it to be repeated. And Lane was in that group. In the late 30s, she testified for a bill, very popular bill, was not successful, but it had a lot of support, called the Ludlow Amendment. And that amendment would have required a national referendum for any declaration of war. And Lane specifically made a comparison to World War I. She testified to Congress, and she said, if we have another war, we will return to the mob hates. World War I, when the mob lates were loose and police power rules, when an unpopular opinion is a crime. Again, she's very consistent in her defense of the First Amendment. Okay, so she pushes that. And then let's go on to the next one, please. But once the U.S. gets in the war, she supports it. And she basically is very, very optimistic, said, we're going to win this war because it's a war against totalitarianism and we have the wherewithal to do it. And she said, win this war? Of course, Americans will win this war. And she said, the only thing that can hold us back is the bureaucracy, is the New Deal-like bungling, inefficiencies and that kind of thing. But she is supportive of the war. Now, shortly after the war, about a year, less than a year after the war, she begins an association with the Pittsburgh Courier. Now, a little bit about the Pittsburgh Courier. The guy who had founded it was named Robert Van. Van was a very, very energetic kind of guy, built this paper up from nothing, very effective at building circulation, also always ahead of the game. Stories like the Scottsboro Boys, he was on top of that from the beginning. He was on top of the rising career of Joe Louis. He sent a foreign correspondent to cover the Ethiopian War during the 1930s. And the paper was built up to substantial circulation under his leadership. He died in 1940, but he'd hired some very good people. His widow sort of took over, but she had a lot of very efficient people to assist her. Now, Lane first, it's a little bit unclear how she first heard about it, but apparently it was from a black housekeeper that she hired or had some sort of dealings with. She started to read copies. She became a subscriber. And then go to the next one, please. And wrote, made some contributions, wrote to this gentleman, man named Joel Augustus Rogers. Rogers was a leading publicizer of Black history, the guy you'd go to find out about Black accomplishments in history and so forth. And given her experiences and her attitudes and her friendliness to this, he interceded and she was hired for the paper. Now, there were a lot of reasons she'd like this paper. It was very, very cosmopolitan. It was a Black paper, but they had op-ed editors. They had a guy that was an advocate of Indian independence. They had a white contributor, and they had this guy, semanticist named S.I. Hayakawa, who later became a U.S. Senator from California. And so very cosmopolitan. She liked that. She didn't like ethnic division. Now, go on to the next one, please. The most accomplished person in the paper at the time, really, or one of the more accomplished people was George S. Schuyler. On the right, there he is with a debate much later in his career with Malcolm X. And Schuyler was making a kind of a transition during this time. He was still on the left, but he was very anti-communist, and there was a very strong tradition on the left. And he was always see these communists are opportunistic. They're trying to exploit the civil rights movement. And he was making a transition to what could be called during the time she's there, a kind of libertarian conservatism. He's very much critical of Roosevelt's policies of segregation in the New Deal, of the dropping of the Japanese internment. He's one of the few figures to really speak out against that. He's against the dropping of the atomic bomb. And apparently she had known Schuyler since the late 30s and always respected him, and certainly shared his criticism of the communists, how they had, in her view, divided people. All right, now go to the next one, please. So she's hired to write a regular column, and she starts the column in October 1942, keeps writing till I think it was, Marcus can remind me, I think it was August 1945 on a weekly basis. And does she go, oh, gee, I got to tone down my laissez-faire stuff that might alienate my audience? No, she doubles down, right? She's a laissez-faire person, and that's the term she uses, by the way. And she thinks this is the greatest system ever, and she's going to promote it to her readers. And she writes this first column here about she's always willing to say, okay, how can I, appeal to my readers. And one of the things the Pittsburgh Courier had launched was the Double V campaign, victory against fascism at home and overseas. And she embraces this very much and sees this as a campaign for individual liberty and says, I'm for individual liberty, and links it together. And here's what she says. It's very enthusiastic. Here at least is a place where I belong. Here are Americans who know the meaning of equality and freedom. And then she also said that she was a novice. She said, I'm a novice. You guys know more about all these issues than I do. I want to learn from you. And she said, I suffered from stage fright. How does a recruit speak? How does she dare to speak in the presence of veterans of a movement she should have joined long ago? How much more time I got here, folks?
You're good, David. Keep going.
I'll take a few more minutes. Stop me when I've gone too far. Now, again, she's very inventive in linking together anti-racism and laissez-faire ideas. And her argument is that the importance that the individual was important over collective constructs. So she said there's race, and that's artificial, collective, pernicious, and class. Same thing. Said we don't want to be dividing people. And she said, instead of indulging in the ridiculous, idiotic, tragic fallacy of race, by which a minority of the Earth's population has deluded itself during the past century, it was time for Americans, black and white, to renounce their race. Judging by skin color, in her view, was comparable to communists assigning guilt or virtue based on class. And she said both, and she called them the delusions of race and class, had a common ancestry of the old English feudal class distinction. And she said, you've got a situation where the collectivists, and she included New Dealers, had filled young minds with fantasies of races and classes, and the masses all controlled by pagan gods. She compared economic determinism. She compared these collective concepts, economic determinism, society or government, to pagan gods that people were worshiping, in her view. Now, go on to the next one, please. Next one, please. Next slide. Okay. You can see some sampling here. Go on to the next one, please. Those are some of her articles. You can sort of see some of the themes. Keep going. I don't know why I repeat that.
There's a little bit of lag between when I push the button and when it gets to you, David.
Okay, that's fine. Keep going. Yeah, there we go. Now, she more lyrically, I guess you could say, quoted a character from on to where we were at the Du Bois thing of W.E. Du Bois. That's the next one, from his 1928 novel Dark Princess. And I don't know if Du Bois would have appreciated this. Very much a guy on the left, but she sort of picks it up. She doesn't claim he's a true believer in her views, and she quotes from him to illustrate a larger point. She quotes from Du Bois's article or a novel, "My grandfather was a whipped and driven slave. My father was never really free and died in jail. My mother plows and washes for a living. We came out of the depths, the blood and mud of battle. And from just such depths, I take it, come out most of the worthwhile things of this old world." And then again, she quotes extensively from that book. And she says at one point, the best translation of laissez-faire into the American language is also a great American song. Go down, Moses, way down into Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. All right. Now, Lane is very much a booster of African-American accomplishments. He said, go on to the next one. It's amazing how well they've done despite the beginning that they suffered. And she writes, they had been born and had lived in concentration camps under guard. They're talking about slaves. They had been worked hard, meagerly fed, denied schooling, churches, privacy, or decency. forbidden to marry, to own property, to read and write without permission. And then she says, with emancipation, they were still bad, but then a good thing. Homeless, penniless, ragged, illiterate, lost among strangers. They had freedom. But then Lane asked provocatively, freedom for what? And then she answered, freedom to starve. Yes, precisely. And again, she's picking out Du Bois. They have freedom to starve. That's a lot better than being in concentration camps. Now, many years later, a historian named Stanley Elkins wrote a well-known book where he compared conditions under slavery to Nazi concentration camps. So she's sort of ahead of the curve here, but her conclusion is very different from Elkins. He sees this as leading to docility and defeatism. Her view is, look how people bounced back from this and look at what they accomplished. She wrote, how did they survive it all? God knows. And I wish some of their brilliant writers would tell us in great works of fiction. For they not only survived, they prospered. They became great writers, scientists, educators, musicians, and doctors, lawyers, capitalists. Behind the wall prejudice that kept them unknown to other Americans, they built up a culture, a society, churches, colleges, business enterprises. They own today property worth tens of billions of dollars. They did this in 80 years, starting from nothing at all. Then she does her clincher, nothing but freedom. And again, I could go on giving examples. I want to let Marcus pick up the story here. But one of the things she did do to try to connect with her audience is she would compare white entrepreneurs like Henry Ford to Black entrepreneurs like Richard Vann. And she would say, look, both of them, one of them put poor people in cars. The other one created a great newspaper that I'm writing for now called the Pittsburgh Courier. And they did it through very similar kinds of things. So she's always looking for ways to connect people, to draw comparisons, to break free from what she sees as a racial kind of, focus and expand it by making comparisons. I have more to say, but I'm going to stop there because I'm going on, and Marcus needs to get his stuff in.
Thank you so much, David. It's great to be here with David. Deidre, thanks so much for having us. As Deidre said, David was my advisor at the University of Alabama, so it's a real honor to have collaborated with him on this. I'm really glad we got to do that. It's something that he had been talking about for years and years and years, and I kind of had some bandwidth, and so we came together to get it done once David decided to retire/go emeritus on us once the pandemic hit. He was smart. He got out. All right, well, let me go ahead and pick up where David sort of left off. David has anticipated some of the things that I want to talk about, but I want to pick up where David left off talking about Black achievement. And in so many ways, Lane was ahead of the curve. Today, right, we're having this conversation about how to integrate more Black voices and more Black achievements into the historical narrative. And Lane is crying out for that, right, in 1943 and 1944, saying there's this rich history that hasn't been addressed and that hasn't been told, and we want to hear it. And one of the things that I want to say is that Lane is part of a deep, deep tradition that is getting more and more attention over the course of the last 5 years or so, as conservatives have moved in a direction very, very different from classical liberalism. They've moved away from classical liberalism, sort of the classical liberalism that may have informed someone like a Ronald Reagan. Sort of a social tolerance and a fiscal conservatism. They've moved in a very different direction under President Trump, not to make it political. But what's happened because of that is that there's been a resurgence in interest in classical liberal ideals and sort of this classical liberal tradition. And Lane is a part of that classical liberal tradition, going all the way back. I mean, you can take it back to the Revolutionary War, which Lane clearly does, right? The founding of this nation, despite what some people would say today, Patrick Deneen and others, is liberal. It's a liberal founding based on the Enlightenment conceptions of individual liberty and rights. And so Lane is very much in that tradition. The most famous classical liberal, sort of Black classical liberal, is probably Frederick Douglass, who all of you are aware of. Booker T. Washington, I think we would consider a classical liberal, who really sort of emphasized thrift, investment, work ethic, etc. And then some of the key leaders of the NAACP, the founder, one of the founders, Moorfield Story, and Oswald Garrison Villard, were very, very dedicated free marketeers who committed to free trade, First Amendment, freedom of speech, etc. And so Lane is writing in this tradition that goes all the way back to the founding. She's also, if you have read Zora and Neale Hurston, many of the same themes and really even some of the same sort of critiques of racism can be found in their work, and they're working relatively at the same time, okay? And so this is sort of this deeper tradition that Lane is a part of, and it's one of the reasons why she's so critical of sort of progressivism and the advent of the New Deal under Roosevelt. Because she comes from this, what she sees as the true American tradition of sort of laissez-faire, individual liberty and rights, sort of a classical liberalism that had sort of generated tremendous amounts of wealth in the 19th century, that had done amazing things, being sort of trampled upon in the 1930s and the 1940s. David already told you this story, so I don't have to, but Lane was always talking about Black entrepreneurs, right? And she highlighted in her column the work of Robert L. Vann, who had founded the Pittsburgh Courier. He's just one of the examples of Black entrepreneurs that Lane talked about in the Courier itself. Some of her other political views that shine through in the columns that we have that are going to be published in the edition that's coming out are these. Lane, when she's praising people like Vann, her goal is not necessarily to sort of glorify the individual entrepreneur, but to really illustrate the benefits of what she calls uncontrolled free markets for ordinary people. For Lane and for so many other classical liberals, the reason why they believe in laissez-faire, the reason why they believe in free markets, is because free markets enable individuals to figure out what the problem is, right? Or what is lacking, what do consumers want, and to fill the void, and to use their own sort of freedom, their own energy, as Lane would say, right? To go and provide for consumers and to make the world a better place. Lane's very careful, and she anticipates major breakthroughs in economics that don't take place until the 1950s, the 1960s. She anticipates the public choice school of economics. She anticipates some really, really insightful things by sort of one of the most famous libertarian economists, F.A. Hayek. She's ahead of him by like 8 years, although he had written about it in the German. She obviously hadn't read that. She distinguished between free enterprise or free market capitalism and was actually very critical of businessmen who tried to use the state to avoid competition, something that we might call corporatism today. She made those distinctions very clear. She also argued that an intrusive state welfare and governmental controlled public education had undermined the freedom and self-control of Americans by chaining them to the whims of politicians. And she was very, very concerned about what happens once people get elected, what type of incentives do they face, and how does that change the way in which they actually govern. She was very skeptical of elected officials. Some might say, she was right-headed, that, they face a different set of incentives. They want to get reelected. And so all that sort of public sort of talk about the public good and whatnot is maybe goes away once they're in office. But she was very concerned about that. Anticipating, once again, public choice in economics, and kind of like her sometimes political ally, Ayn Rand, who she's linked with, she glorified individualism and warned about the negative consequences of too much altruism. Now, I want to play you guys just a brief sort of clip from Lane, so you get a sense of what she sounded like, what type of arguments she made, and I think you'll get a sense of like the arguments that she's making about how the American Revolution sort of instructs, if you will, the human flourishing that she sees in the 1930s and the 1940s.
We will now hear from Mrs. Rose Wilder Lane. Mrs. Lane, if you please.
In 1776, Americans began the World Revolution. They established here the first equality of all men under law. They established the first limited government, prevented by law from restricting the liberty of any honest citizen. They declared the World Revolution They all declared it. In 1775, Thomas Paine said, "We have it in our power to make a new world." In 1820, our sixth president said to Americans, "When the time shall come for your representatives to determine the government of Corsica and Cuba, of Ceylon and Madagascar, that time has come now." Since 1789, our revolution has caused outbreaks, rebellions, revolutions in every country on this earth. The old world has constantly reacted against the very ideas of human equality and individual freedom. Now this reaction in Germany, in Italy, in Japan causes this world war. And Americans are fighting. We are fighting for the America, for the world, the new world that free men create. We have begun to make it. We can see what it is. It is the first rapidly changing world, dynamic, progressive. In 1 century, free men have created more good for human beings than 6,000 years of the old planned world. Nobody can plan this new world because nobody can imagine what it will be tomorrow. Free individuals plan their own affairs, and their pursuit of happiness creates entirely new things. Until 1 century ago, hunger was always killing people. Whole populations died in famine, and they still do everywhere outside our new world. Only in this new world have workers ever had enough to eat. Only in this new world have ordinary people ever worn shoes. Never before and nowhere else has everyone had such an increasing abundance of all good things.
I'll go ahead and stop it there. It's an interesting piece of audio that David found. And I think it really does demonstrate her belief in the American founding and her belief in the ideals, right, of sort of enlightenment or liberalism, which I've been talking about a little bit and David talked about a little bit. The graph that's behind that it serves as the background to this shows you GDP per capita from sort of the beginning of time until around 1750 or so, and you can see it begin to go up. Unfortunately, the graphic cut it off, but that would have been around the turn of the 1900s. You see it sort of going up, and it continues up today until it's all the way up here at the top. This is called the hockey stick graph. It's probably the most important graph in economic history, because around 1750 or so, GDP per capita, sort of what people made, income skyrocketed. Lane would say that's a product of what we might call market liberalism, right? The ideas of the American Revolution and market capitalism. You don't have to agree with her, but that's what Lane believed it to have been a product of. And so Lane really did praise the American Revolution, the American founding, the principles, right, that undergirded the Declaration and the Constitution. But she did try to shy away from sort of narrow-minded nationalism. She really stressed that African, Arabic, and Indian civilizations had actually started far ahead of Europeans in their scientific and architectural development, including mathematics and whatnot. And she even had a sort of a soft spot for Islam. She had, where did she travel to, David? Was it Armenia? Where did she travel to? Georgia? Was it Georgia that she encountered?
Well, Albania. She lived in Albania quite a long time. So that would have been her main exposure to Islam.
Right. And she had this sort of captured her imagination. She even joked about becoming a convert at one point. She ultimately never did become a convert. But she wrote about these civilizations and about how, at given times they had institutional structures and frameworks that had granted property rights and that had unleashed human energy and human freedom and led to flourishing. But unfortunately, that had been clamped down upon, right? The state or the king or the ruler, whoever it might be, came in and cracked down on individual liberty. And as a result, those civilizations didn't continue to flourish in the same way that the American sort of experiment and in the West it had. According to Lane, she really believed it was private property, entrepreneurship, and freedom that led to human flourishing. And she was very much a supporter of the ideals that she believed led to that flourishing in the United States. David mentioned the discovery of freedom, but it is truly Lane's political magnum opus. It was published in January of 1943, a few months after her tenure with the Courier had begun. And many of her columns in the Courier were both a preview and an elaboration of the philosophical ideas of that book, including the theory that autonomous individuals possessed in equal measure a kind of energy. According to Lane, governments were incapable of marshaling this energy, but societies that left people alone to exercise their inalienable rights would flourish. Quote, each living person is a source of this energy. There is no other source. Individuals generate it and control it, end quote. By contrast, the centralizing state, be it communist, Nazi, or New Deal, rested on, quote, a pagan faith that an outside authority of some type controls or should control individuals, end quote. While the discovery of freedom has become the best known expression of Lane's political philosophy, her weekly columns in the Courier reached, or at least potentially reached, around 270,000 people, as David said earlier, every week, whereas the discovery of freedom during Lane's lifetime had only sold about 1,000 copies. And so Lane in the Courier, so if you end up purchasing the book, right, if you end up reading the columns, you can really see, you might read it alongside Discovery of Freedom and see a sort of an expanding on some of the ideas that were found in what sort of classical liberals and libertarians believe to be her greatest work. Because the Discovery of Freedom appeared in the same year as Isabel Patterson, The Woman in the Middle, her book, The God of the Machine, and Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, scholar Stephen Cox and others have called this trio of authors the Libertarians of 43, and they come to be known as the three mothers of libertarianism. Similarly, National Review founder William F. Buckley Jr. dubbed them the three furies of modern libertarianism, and there's a recently released book called Freedom's Furies by Timothy Sandifer, if you'd like to. Shouldn't plug other people's books, but I am. If you'd like to learn more about these three. And so all three of these women came together and sort of formed the sort of intellectual foundation for the libertarian movement, which sort of took over from classical liberalism in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so Lane is appreciated by a whole group of people, right? These sort of libertarians as one of their founding sort of members. Lane had a penchant for also sort of speaking her mind and not caring what it led to. And she definitely did that during the 1940s, during World War II. Twice during the war, Lane's dissenting attitudes crossed over into direct action. So she not only wrote in the Courier, but she also took direct action in at least 2 points that we know of. The first time was in early 1943 in response to a broadcasting feature featuring Samuel Grafton, a contributor to the New Republic and a New Dealer. He provoked her by combining sort of praise for Social Security with a call to send American teachers to educate Germans about democracy. Lane decided to scribble him a postcard which said that if American teachers told German children, quote, "We believe in Social Security," the children will ask, "Then why did you fight Germany?" All these Social Security laws are German, instituted by Bismarck and expanded by Hitler, end quote. In a final flourish, he added that Americans still did not want to be taxed for their own good and bossed around by bureaucrats, end quote. This protest would have ended the matter had not somebody who considered the card to be subversive informed the FBI regional office. A state trooper sent at the behest of the FBI came to Lane's house to check into it. When the trooper said that he did not like her attitude, she was ready to pounce. Quote, "I am an American citizen. I hire you. I pay you. And you have the insolence to question my attitude? What is this, the Gestapo?" End quote. After some more back and forth, Lane asked the flustered trooper if the postcard was subversive. He said that he believed that it was. To which she responded, "Well, then I'm subversive as hell." The trooper promptly backed off, promising not to pursue the matter because he said Lane was a writer, which also infuriated Lane. She gave him no relief, declaring that it was her right as an American citizen, not only as a writer, to speak as she pleased. The trooper slinked away, but Lane was only getting warmed up. She publicly demanded the name of the person who had informed on her and asked if the federal government was censoring the mail of Americans. Her subsequent letter to J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, promised that when, quote, an investigator put so much as a toe of his boot across the line, protecting any American citizen's right to free thought and free speech, I regard it as that citizen's duty to refuse to permit this and to raise a loud yell, end quote. Newspapers that commented on the incident almost all took Lane's side. Roger Baldwin, the head of the American Civil Liberties Union, wrote to Hoover on her behalf. An editorial in the Chicago Daily Tribune, the key national voice of the old right that David mentioned earlier, was especially hard-hitting. It urged Congress to question Attorney General Francis Biddle and his subordinate J. Edgar Hoover. Who do they think they are? The answer appears to be Himmler. Although Hoover loyally defended his bureau publicly, he privately characterized the original inquiry as, quote, ridiculous, and suggested, I would say pragmatically and practically, that, quote, if we haven't something more important and pressing to do, then we ought to go ahead and cut personnel. Lane's second foray into direct action was a one-woman protest against rationing and ration cards. Her method was to become almost completely self-sufficient on her 3-acre farm in Connecticut. She said, quote, if a person admits government has the right to say if he can eat, there is no liberty left, end quote. She raised her own hogs, cows, and chickens and grew her own vegetables, made 800 jars of preserves during the war, and used honey as a substitute for sugar. Her only income was the $60 a month that she received from her columns in the Courier. She boasted that self-sufficiency allowed her to earn a living through writing fiction. It also kept her income so low, she happily advertised, that she no longer had to pay taxes to the federal government. That did not bring about the support that her FBI resistance did. People condemned her for not, quote unquote, paying more, right, doing her fair share of whatnot to help out with the war effort. Lane ultimately exited the Courier in September of 1945 when she was informed by the executive editor, P.L. Prattis, who she personally liked and seemed to have a good rapport with, that they no longer needed her services. She later said this was the only time that she had been fired from a job and suspected that Prattis had acted for political reasons. She elaborated many years later that she may have inadvertently got caught in the middle of the growing ideological tensions between George Schuyler, who was making his transition from sort of New Dealer to libertarian, which would eventually lead him to sort of reactionary conservative by the end of his life. And Schuyler had become increasingly hostile to the Roosevelt administration and to the rest of the newspaper's staff. As Lane said, quote, 2 of us were too much to be endured by that nest of leftists. George Schuyler says, since they could not get him, they went ahead and got me, end quote. On one count, Lane was correct. Prattis had closely aligned himself with the leftist faction and the Roosevelt administration, and was somewhat contemptuous of rugged individualism and quote-unquote reactionaries. We're about to the hour mark, so I'm going to go ahead and accelerate us through. Lane, in the next 2 decades of her life, rarely alluded to her time at the Pittsburgh Courier, at least not in print. And she very rarely commented on matters of race. She devoted most of her efforts in those 20 years to playing a hands-on role in launching the libertarian movement, a term that she also apparently coined. She wrote book reviews for the National Economic Council and then Volcker Fund, the organization from which the Institute for Humane Studies later emerged. And despite sharing some views with Ayn Rand, the two had sort of a strained relationship. Although never a practicing Christian, Lane, unlike the atheistic Rand, lauded the positive contributions of the sort of shared Jewish, Muslim, Christian tradition. She also kept her distance during those years from William F. Buckley Jr. and his new National Review, which would, of course, go on to sort of help launch the conservative movement post-World War II in the United States that would ultimately elect Ronald Reagan. Buckley's version of conservatism struck her as aristocratic and reactionary, a holdover from the philosophy that, quote, a commonwealth is a mystic being, that governments are ordained by God, end quote. Much more to her liking was the Libertarian Freedom School, headed by Robert Lefebvre. Baby, don't help me, it's French.
Lefebvre.
Lefebvre. All right, a charismatic
Yes.
radio commentator and businessman, where she guest lectured. I should know that. At one point, Lane almost emptied her modest banking account to keep that freedom school alive. She also worked with the Foundation for Economic Education. So she was very involved in her last 20 years. So really sort of growing and building and fighting for the views and the ideas that she had laid out in Discovery of Freedom, that she had laid out in the Pittsburgh Courier. The last 20 years or so since around 2020, 2004, 2005, have brought about a new appreciation of Lane as a political activist and as a collaborator on the Little House books. But her columns in the Pittsburgh Courier, as well as her broader comments about African Americans and civil rights, have not really received their due. And so David and I sincerely hope that this edited collection will rectify that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcus and Dave. How wonderful. So we have, I think we'll take a couple of minutes. We're right at the end of the hour. We've got a couple of questions, mostly running conversations, which have been really fascinating, actually. But Scott Boren wants to know, he's got some roots in De Smet. What or in what ways or how did Rose's family help form her political views?
How did her what?
How her family helped form her political views.
You know, I'm not as much of an expert on her early family background and the influences, but I think in a rough sense, they were, they had a kind of pioneer mentality, a kind of self-help mentality. And one aspect of this is interesting that is we're talking about. She's an individualist in some ways, they are, but they combine individualism. And a lot of people see a contradiction here. I really don't, with kind of a community attitude. They're joiners to a great extent, like a lot of people were on the frontier. They belong, to the fraternal organizations like the Masons and the Eastern Star. And then Lane belongs to some groups as well when she's living in Danbury, Connecticut, which is, by the way, where she's living when she writes for the Pittsburgh Courier. Although she does come in periodically to participate in events at the Courier. So she, Lane is sometimes depicted as this kind of rugged, selfish individualist, and that doesn't really fit here. You could say it for some people, but not really for her. She has, a couple children that she adopts. She's at the Courier. She's very much always offering her services to people. She offers her services to young people. It says, please send me your manuscripts. I'll help you. I've got some experience as a writer. Let me help you. There's it's not just a kind of rugged, individualism, I guess you could say, or stereotypical individualism.
Yeah, and that belief in voluntary association, right, is really important to the classical liberal tradition, and it's really, really important to the Black American tradition, right? Community matters a great deal, sort of like, race, sort of Lane might not like this, but sort of race solidarity. Like, you have to help people out. You have to chuck and barter and help folks and be there for people. And I mean, Black fraternal societies, I'm going to tell David about this. He wrote a whole book about it. Were extraordinarily important to Black civil society. And so I think that's absolutely correct, right? Voluntary association was really, really important. It would have been something that she experienced in her childhood, combined with sort of the always having to figure out a way, right, to survive and to sort of carry on. It sort of ingrains within someone, right? I think a sort of ethos, an individualistic ethos, a sort of an ability to buck up and meet challenges with the help of your neighbors, with your community, but definitely, right, this can-do attitude.
And we've got another great question here. Was it common for the Black papers to feature white authors, particularly women? Was this to help give themselves legitimacy to white audiences? If not, why was Lane the exception?
I don't know why they do that. I think that I think they really do want to have a dialogue. I think that the Pittsburgh Courier does want to do that. And but that's a good question. What went into the thought process? But this very conscious, right? If you look at their op-ed page, it's very clear that it's intentional, that they want to have someone from this group and that group and so forth. And Lane would have appreciated that, but I don't know what the thought process was that went into that.
Well, David, is that unique though to the Courier that they would have had? Because from my experience with Black papers, I feel like that is something unique to the Courier, this sort of cosmopolitan editorial board. But you have more experience in this time period than I do, so I'll defer to you on this. But
no, I think it is. I think it's unique.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not common. Let's put it that way. Outside of the Courier that I've seen.
And it seems
right?
like
maybe they're trying to downplay kind of, a kind of race-centered focus. But again, it's very much a pro-civil rights paper and everything. So,
and they have perspective. They don't, they have diversity in terms of sort of racial diversity, but they also have diversity in terms of intellectual and ideological diversity on the editorial.
Yes, they do.
Which, if we are to listen to Lane, maybe they got kind of tired of there being too much representation of.
Well, the paper itself had famously, the publisher had endorsed Roosevelt in 1932, and this is quoted by historians because it was a traditional Republican paper. And he said, "Turn your pictures of Lincoln to the wall." Well, he did do that, but then in 36 and 40, he went back to the Republicans again. So it was a paper that wasn't really locked into one point of view. I think it's fair to say.
And this next question is a really good follow-up on that, and we'll bring things to a close after we discuss this. Did any of Rose Lane's work in the Courier add to our understanding of her views on Native Americans? Kind of a reference to how that's been a bit problematic of late in analyses of Little House books.
Marcus, you want to tackle this or should I?
You go ahead and then I'll add.
Okay. I think it does elaborate on it and maybe add to it. Now, what is her attitude towards Native Americans? Because she does discuss them in the Courier. Her attitude is very similar to her attitude against, toward, say, peasants in Georgia or in the Caucasus. She thinks that they're just like everybody else, but they've been held back by institutional systems. And here's where we criticize her, and it's understandable in a way, because this was the common view at the time. She sort of sees Native Americans as primitive communists. And she said, that just isn't consistent with the modern world. They don't have private property. They don't have any rewards if they make money. And so therefore, they don't even want to live there in these places now. Given a choice, they don't want to live in places like that anymore. Now, the problem with that argument is a couple things. One is that there's a wide variety of institutions among Native Americans. And had she maybe read more, but again, it's sort of the view at the time, read the anthropology, you'd find there are Native American communities, societies that have private property, that are individualistic, and so forth. And that this view that they're all primitive communists isn't really very accurate. But I think one thing I would say in her defense is it's not a race-based view at all. Her view is they've been screwed over because they've got these institutions that hold them back, just like peasants in the Caucasus, right? And they can flourish if they have freedom. And they don't really have freedom now because of, but again, I think she misunderstands the history there. So I think that's you would have to have a nuanced view here. It's not a racist view. I think that's quite clear.
Yeah.
It's perhaps a misunderstanding and a kind of paternalism. I don't know what you'd call it, but it's not racism.
I think it's also important to remember that Rose Wilder Lane is kind of a popularizer, right? Rose Wilder Lane is not a PhD in history. And you know, there were, if you're looking at the books written at the time, could she have maybe have known more? Perhaps. But if you're thinking about the things that David's drawing on, the books that David's drawing on, I read in graduate school. Those books were written, what, David, in the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s. It's very, very hot now, 2010. Like, we know a lot more about these institutions because there's been an increase of interest, right? And so, like, to a certain extent, I think Rose Wilder Lane was just simply a product of her time, right? She may have been ignorant of these institutions. She just didn't know. But I don't know how much we today should hold that against her. I'm always telling my students, like, the task of the historian is to contextualize, to understand people in their own time and in their own place, and have empathy for them and trying to understand where they're coming from, what their arguments are. Not necessarily, we can still think they're wrong, right? That's perfectly legitimate. But it would be, I think, unfair, right, to ascribe some sort of like racist sort of argument that Lane's making against Native Americans from the things that she said in the Courier. I think David's absolutely right about that. And I just constantly encourage all Americans to have a little bit more empathy for people in the past. I can't wait to see what people in 50 years judge me for, right? Probably not very much because they probably won't know who I am. But like if I was famous, right, the norms 50 years from now will be very, very different from today. And so I think we need to have a little bit of empathy and a little bit of understanding for figures in the past. So I'll leave it with that.
And I think we'll wrap things up. We usually don't go past 8 o'clock. So that is a testament to what an exciting and exhilarating and interesting discussion we've been having here. I do want to throw out, because there's been a lot of talk in the chat about this audio that Dave found, and some other people had found it too. Shout out to Sarah and to John Bass, Sarah talk. And there's a discussion about the elocution lessons the Ingalls girls had and how much does Rose sound like her mother and things like that. Yes, we will have that audio available when the book is goes into pre-order, which we'll let you all know, and we create a web page for it on our sdhspress.com website, and we'll have a page for the book, and hopefully we'll be able to put that audio recording there. And there's discussion about, there's probably there are more audios we think with the Lefebvre School. I don't know where those archives are. David, do you know?
No, I don't.
Freedom School, where those archives are, but maybe a quick search, or John Bass.
Look into it. We haven't
on there.
to find
anyway,
John Bass probably knows. He knows everything.
Yeah. If John, I was gonna say, John, if you know, you can put in there, but yeah, what a far-reaching conversation we've been having. This is so much fun.